So let's make a segue with the presentation by Philippe Côté and Marc-Olivier Lemonde. They are both at the team of the Forest Inventory Directorate. Philippe Côté, who's coming to the stage, is a bachelor's in geomatics with engineering option. He's been a project manager for airborne photography with us. He's responsible for airborne photography and LiDAR. Marc-Olivier, after Philippe Côté, we also have Marc-Olivier. He's also a forest engineer. Marc-Olivier is our expert in derived products, their creation, and expertise transfer. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to present this morning. It's a presentation made in cooperation with Marc-Olivier Lemonde. I am Philippe Côté. The title of my presentation is LiDAR Acquisition, the Present and the Future, New Derived Products to Increase Spin-offs in Forestry. The presentation will be made in two parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the operational parameters for acquisitions, for data acquisitions. What it means is all the variables, all the parameters and the settings we use to do the airborne surveys, how it's done technically, everything that comes before data processing. Marc-Olivier will present the second part, which deals with the processing of those data. And he will present derived products and all the various treatments and processes he applies to the data delivered by our service providers. Acquisitions. By whom, for whom, and why? How did it start? Well, it started at the government of Quebec, slightly, on a small scale. As Antoine said earlier, at the beginning, the first acquisitions were conducted by the Department of Transport in 2006, somewhere around those dates. It's to analyze slopes for landslides that could affect roads. Those were surveys that was done mostly in the spring where there were no leaves, and in the fall after the leaves had fallen. So that was their needs. They needed those surveys. That's what they did. Then what came at the Department of Forest, Wildlife and Parks, we started some projects, laser-based projects, from 2010 at our directorate for forest inventory. Those projects were done in cooperation with the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, which is in charge of the contract management for those projects. It's the geographical information branch that manages the contracts. We're like the client of that directorate for the public calls for tenders. All the data acquisition contracts are given out through public calls for tenders through the Quebec government public tendering system that is published on the SEAO site, and all providers that meet the criteria can apply or can bid or make a quote for the data acquisition projects, or LiDAR acquisition specifically. It's been used in the forest sector since 2011 and 2012. What are the technical parameters and costs? When we started the first data acquisition projects, one thing that was important for us was to use in our technical criteria laser scans that could have 100,000 pulses per second. That was a criterion that had been set to make sure that we had a high quality of scanning, or a sufficiently dense cloud of points. We didn't want to have scanners that were any lower quality than that. So that was one of our requirements, 100,000 pulses per second at 100 kilohertz. We also required these scanners to be able to have multiple returns. That's very important. Since our surveys are done with a forest cover, it's important to be able to have several signal returns in order to go sometimes all the way down to the ground, to the soil. That's another requirement we had, a minimum of 4 returns. We also want to be able to record signal intensity. That's an important point also. It could be a plus. If we need to analyze the point cloud, the data cloud, and of course we require these surveys to be well positioned in space to make sure that these surveys are well positioned. We require an inertial central on the part of the service provider in the plane with GPS positioner, basic station, and so on, and differential correction of all the data. And we will also require it from the service provider, in addition to that inertial navigator platform, to correct for altimetry and so on. We will require the service provider to do terrain sections. There will be sections carried out on flat terrain or terrains with slopes, and so the service provider can calibrate their data and adjust their devices carefully so those terrain profiles are delivered to us and delivered to our branch in our final products. That's validated, and that's a way to do some quality control. That's another requirement we have in terms of positioning in space. We also require 30% overlap of the flight lines. And we're very much inspired by the LiDAR-based specifications of the U.S. Geological Survey in the U.S. They have a standards book. They have a guide that's called Guidelines. So we use this. We're very much inspired by those American guidelines to build our technical specifications. As I said, data have to be adjusted and the flight lines have to be calibrated to make sure. We need an absolute vertical precision of plus or minus 50 centimeters for the surveys in terms of vertical precision. Now, let me move on to the evolution of costs since 2006. As Antoine said earlier, there have been regional acquisitions that took place in 2011, from 2011 to 2013. Those data acquisition projects were conducted for specific operational projects. There was a whole lot of small points for smaller sectors, sometimes slightly bigger areas, very much scattered across the territory. So that created a lot of plane travel costs. So the costs were very high in terms of price per square kilometer. It could cost up to $257 per square kilometer. And large-scale acquisitions, we realized that if we had larger-scale acquisitions, then that really lowered the costs. And for the two projects for 2013 and 2014, we had an average cost of about $60 per square kilometer. It's really a great improvement. We even saw costs plummet even further down than that in the Côte-Nord project on the Quebec North Shore. So this coverage, this larger coverage, really reduced the costs because there's a lot of plane travel costs, but when you have smaller territories. Another interesting aspect, which we refined over time in our technical specifications, is the point density. At the beginning, we asked for point densities. We told people you'll do the survey with 2 points per square meter, but we didn't specify any other parameter about that. But recently, in the last 2 years, we introduced in our specifications a notion of cells. We ask the service provider to make sure that on 90% of the 20-meter cells, we'll get our density of either 1.5 point per square meter in softwood forest, or 2.5 points per square meter in deciduous forest. By doing that, we can have a better uniformity, more consistency in terms of density. I'll be able to show you that in the next two slides, and that gives very conclusive results. It's really positive. René will speak to you about that. He analyzed those densities. We did it together, but he did more of the processing. It really gives interesting results in terms of density. It's more consistent. We excluded the areas that were less well covered in terms of density. So our point density is consistent on all the contracts. All this is delivered in terms of file format. It used to be delivered in the LAS format. Since the disk space is pretty costly and we have large projects coming on, because those are secured hard disk spaces. You can't buy a $100 disk at Best Buy. It's not that kind of disk. It's pretty costly. So we made a decision to use this year with the LAS tools, the tile compression using the LAS format, the .las file. It just reduced the space, the disk space, by 6 to 8 times without any loss of information. So it's a data compression system with no destruction involved. It is perfect. So that would allow us to save storage space on disk, so disk space costs for the coming years. I'd like to add that eventually we're also considering compressing all the old data so as to save storage costs. As you can see here, that's an example of a density that Marc-Olivier generated. You see a density of 2.5 points per square meter on 90% of the 20-meter cells. And if we analyze all that, we have an average of 4 to 5 points per square meter overall. It goes even beyond what we were asking for in the specs. So the result is very good. And what we had before was something like this. That was a 2-point density without specifying cells or anything. So we still have that 2 points per square meter overall in terms of density. But you see that there are bigger areas where the data are weaker, even outside of lakes or in certain territories. Sometimes it's lower, even in some forested areas. We won't have that now with our new way of specifying things in the specs, that notion of density. As we said, we'll use densities of 1.5 compared to 2.5 based on the deciduous and the bioclimatic subdomains. So higher density in deciduous forests. Don't ask me any questions about this climate subdomains. It's not my field. I'm not a forester. Then the classification of the raw data. In 2014, the classification used the LAS tools for the Operational Coordination Directorate project. Marc-Olivier processed the data using those tools, the LAS tools. We did a basic form of classification. We used tools to get to the soil and the unclassified points. For the provincial project, however, in our specs, we include a requirement that the service provider should ensure classification since the volumes are quite big. So we require 3 classes in terms of the points: soil, water, and the rest of the points have an unclassified flag. They're processable, and we process them. We know that those are the points to be classified. It does the job. So with that simple classification in 3 classes: soil, water, and the rest. Product delivery, for each product, we require a tile system. Tiles are 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. With the densities we have, it's pretty heavy in terms of disk space, and a tile of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer is easy to manage. It's easy to calculate. If you have 1,000 tiles, it's simply 1,000 kilometers. And that's a format we've been using for a number of years. A few years ago, we had used tiles of 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers or 2 by 2. But with the increased densities, the files were becoming too heavy. So we're now using 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tiles. As I said earlier, tile compression will be done without any loss and reducing the storage space. We use the free utilitarian last zip to do that. I'm pretty much done. Marc-Olivier will now come to present to you the various products. Hi, good morning. I'm here to talk about the derived products which we have prepared using LiDAR files. Originally, when we did the acquisition, and we had 3,000 files because we had 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer tiles. We had 3,000 LAS files, 3,000 surface models, and 3,000 terrain models. That we said to ourselves that might not be ideal for general people to use. I enclose myself in the office because usually in the office I speak a lot, I move a lot around the various offices, and I confine myself. I want to thank Sébastien, Raymond, and Pierre Laure, who helped me, and we realized derived products, the basic derived products that I'm going to present to you now. We needed a scale. So we said, okay, if I look at this, if I do tiles of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, I will have 2,000 derived products times 4. That will give me 8,000 derived products. That might not be ideal. So we decided to use another reference unit, which is recognized by most foresters in Quebec, which is the Quebec mapping referencing system, which we'll call the 20,000 sheets. If we got about 250,000 square kilometers per sheet. The products were made the following way. Each sheet is a superposition of 4 to 10 meters, and the pixels that are super. If I want to display 8,000 kilometers in a blow, I can display them in QGS or TGS, and superposition is just perfect. You don't realize that there are several products involved. Like here, we have about 9 sheets, and earlier we had 2,000 tiles. So it's really interesting. To make display easier, I inserted the visualization pyramids. Everything is inserted in the files. You took that and you insert them into. We realize proposed symbologies. If you don't like those symbols, you can change them. There's no problem. Presently, they're proposed for ArcGIS. The .lyr points, we use the version 9.3 and over. And this summer, I want to develop that so that people, since there will be open data, people will be able to download an open software, which is IGS, to display the symbols that are used. That's about it for that. So we have 4 basic derived products. Antoine presented them. I'm not going to go too much into details. First of all, we have the terrain model, which digital terrain model is soil elevation. Visually, it's not very interesting, but it's probably the most interesting to make other derived products, to operationalize slopes, altitude, isolates, or watershed-based maps or linear maps. It doesn't look interesting, but the information that it contains is very rich. Our flagship project is the shadowed L-shade digital model. We did that at a 2-meter resolution. I don't want this to be too fine so that we don't see too many pixels. This is a 3D representation of the terrain relief. I won't get too much into details, but I got to see a map interpreter because I wanted to look smart in front of you. If you look at that map, there's not a lot of things. There's not a lot of deposits. So when the glaciation went through, not too many deposits were deposited. And you can probably see that when the glacier withdrew, the melting water went through this and left some material in place. So here we have really a sand plateau and a place here where the material will be the finest. And if I had to plan for a forest road in that area, that could be a route that I would find very interesting to plan for a road. Then we have the canopy height model, which will represent the height of trees, the relative height of trees compared to the soil level, ground level, with a resolution of 1 meter. And we also have a slope map. We propose to you a slope map slopes can be developed from the digital terrain model, but we wanted to propose a fine resolution of 2 meters. Why 2 meters? What we wanted to see is that's important for forest operations. We want to have the breaks come out. Sometimes little breaks, that height will come up very well if they're large enough. And if ever you want to have slopes that are not as fine, you can take the terrain model and change it a little bit, and you do a slope map the way you want it to be. Another example, Antoine showed you a couple of examples earlier. I wanted to mention here the symbology that we propose comes from Simon Vissel, who's been working with that for many years now. Some regions asked me to change that list of symbols. I had no problem, but the list of symbols that is proposed is this one for now. And once you know your symbols, you see very interesting things, like, for example, with my pointer, that is a stand. There is a cut that occurred in 30 to 40 years ago. It's well regenerated. We talk about trees that are 12 meters high. Here I have a stand of yellow birch with sugar maple. I don't know the territory very well, but someone who knows the territory can say in that zone, well, the yellow birch will be more prevalent than the maple. All these red trees are more than 30 meters. It might be yellow birch. I might be saying anything here, but when you know your territory, you can analyze the canopy height model, and that's very rich and dense information. In terms of the slope map, we see very well here that there's a lot of constraints to operations here. I thank Simon for his symbols. What's interesting with that symbology, when you see the pink, it means that it's a bit constraining for operations. Red are high slopes, steep slopes, 40% and more. In pale gray, the machine doesn't go through, and in dark gray, it really doesn't go through. So it's very abrupt slopes, very steep slopes. So that's interesting to have a map like this. You see some breaks here, and there's quite a good fine-tuning in the data. Those are the basic derived products that will be available on the web portal.
Right now we have 55,000 square kilometers that have been processed, and there will soon be more that will be available. And now I want to talk to you about the operability derived products. Right now we're developing them, and internally we want to develop them, and also with the industry we want to have field visits. Just a second, I'm going to catch my breath here. So we're going to go in the field to make sure that the quality is there. We want to determine if internally we can do this, because the LiDAR team is myself and Monsieur Côté, so we're a small team. So what are the derived products that we can propose? We have the products that are constraining for operations, so we have strong inclinations, 30% and more of deposit layer. And we have polygonal slopes. So we're going to go get the deposit, and we'll figure out if the ground is thin or thick. So we're going to have zones that are perhaps within other zones, so we can figure out if a plateau is inaccessible or not. This is information that we can get. We have marshes or wet areas. We can get hydric information. Perhaps we can get 200 square meters, small wetlands that might cause problems. So support for forest operations, we have sand, fine sand, material that might be useful, could be taking the ice off the roads in the winter. And then we have a gravel material. Find out if it's so this is very good material, the Esker 2AE. And now I'm going to ask you can discuss with us as well. This is a proposition, but we're talking with the industry partners as well, and you can come see us at our table downstairs. So here is a picture taken by another photo interpreter with several different products. Here we have the strongly inclined slopes. Here we have hydrography. And here we have wetlands or marshes. Here we have another one. And if you look at the difference in topography, we're going to take aerial photos. And without those pictures, we wouldn't be able to know if these were wetlands or not. So we combine this information. Here we have escarres. We have dunes. So that's a summary. So if I was to work in this area, you see the road would already be there, but in order to plan the construction of roads, it's very useful information for the people who are going to work in the field, on the terrain. So I'm almost done. Several developments for hydrography, figuring out the contour of the lakes can be done with LiDAR. We also did linear photos with LiDAR, and we went in the field, and I was surprised. We want to push LiDAR technology as far as possible. We have a project with figuring out rubining. So we developed tools to establish density, height, slopes, and structure for the forest stands, and we're determining the kind of structure that we'd like to establish. And since we're looking forward, once LiDAR has passed, we're going to have a digital model of the terrain. There will be new technology of aerial photography. So many studies have been done, and there can be a consolidation with the different images, so we can have a digital surface image, and we can get a good idea of the canopy. So these are 30 centimeter pictures. You can see the resolution of the image is not the same, but there's a lot of information here. You can see the 30-meter and taller trees. Knowing that the prices for these pictures is decreasing, these are things that we're looking at. Thank you very much. I know I spoke very fast, but I always speak fast.